Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm trying to wake myself up, but it is lecture 9, uh, the third and final lecture for today, uh, and this one is simply titled African Literature, which is a bit ambitious because I am not going to talk about all African literature, but it's just a working title. Um, so this will start with a notion, a novel that I've already mentioned, Things Fall Apart. I knew would be somewhat familiar to many of you, and it's therefore useful to use some texts that we all know as case studies. Um, so I'll just simply start. A September 2015 article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a publication in North America, and a very good one, in a piece titled A Broader Notion of African Literature, reported by Jennifer Howard. This is a journalist for this publication, describes fascinating scholarly work being done in African literature that shows how the continent, quote, has a long, diverse history of written as well as oral storytelling and record keeping, and that African ideas have influenced Western writers, even though African writers' responses to colonialism and its aftermath have gotten the lion's share of attention. So, useful to keep in mind that African ideas have been influencing the West and the world much longer and more powerfully than we have tended to think. In fact, if I haven't read it, but I've read bits of it, there's a famous work called Black Athena by Martin Bernal, uh, who many years ago showed, for example, even as far back as ancient times, how Africa had influenced the West, and makes the still debatable argument, which because it's hard to disprove or prove these, but he's very convincing that African ideas shaped Athens quite a bit, right? So, all of which is to say that this was 10 years ago, that this was becoming a growing field. Right. So, the setting, of course, of Things Fall Apart is an Igbo village in uh, a region of what is today Nigeria. There was no Nigeria in the late 1800s. And of course, we have the main character of Okonkwo. So I'll get right to some of the themes and the commentary rather than summarize this. There are many, many themes, of course, masculinity, femininity, and patriarchy and so forth, but also how tremendous change, such as that brought by twin European forces of one is Christianity, the other is um, colonialist administration. Those do not always go together. So we see, in fact, that one Mr. Brown is different from uh, uh, Mr. Smith is different from Reverend Brown, and so the guy named Brown, intentionally named, is more sympathetic to the Africans than the very generically named Mr. Smith, which Achebe is having fun with because, stereotyping the Africans with one name, right? Um, so that is certainly the biggest point. But it is also a response, in a way, it's a work of art. It's one of the great novels, but it's a rebuttal, in a way, can be read as a rebuttal or a response to the many works that he had been forced to read and was still reading because he wrote this in 1958, 2 years before Nigeria's independence, um, that he had to read that were by Europeans writing about Africa, or was the canon of European writing. Now, it's not that he loves Shakespeare and all these great writers. That's not the point. But he did, as you know, and we've mentioned, was very angry about Joseph Conrad's thing, Heart of Darkness, that he read in his colonial education. And So in a way, this is a response, though it stands on its own. It doesn't. I don't mean to say it has to be a response to European text. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And in that sense, then, as any great work of art does, it shows the complexity of humans. So we have the flaws within the Igbo system, the killing of twins, for example, um, the hyper masculinity that he feeds on as an individual because his father was, in his view, lazy, right? And those kinds of things. The, so his point would be that yes, there was the killing of twins, but already one character, a friend of Okonkwo's named Obierika, is questioning this, right? Uh, there are other characters who are questioning these practices. What's the point to be made, of course, is that they are not allowed to continue doing it on their own terms. Change is not allowed on their own terms. It's imposed on them, and that change is usually detrimental. So the double tragedy of Okonkwo already being primed for tragedy with a kind of classic tragic flaw, right? And then the last, blow is colonialism. So this is directly uh, a direct answer to Conrad's sort of stick figure Africans, right? Even though I think Conrad is a more complex case, but even though Conrad certainly says the heart of darkness is in Europe, right? And he indicts imperialism, but he never really humanizes the Africans. That's the problem. So, um, here's a passage from Conrad's novel. Just I think it's useful to refresh. I'll just read a couple of lines. The whites of, and Marlowe is narrating this. The whites, of course, greatly composed, had besides a curious look of being painfully shocked by such an outrageous row. So there's an argument between them and some of the African men in the Congo, the Belgian Congo. The others had an alert, naturally interested expression, but their faces were essentially quiet, even those of the one or two who grinned as they hauled at the chain. They're chained up. Several exchanged short, grunting phrases which seemed to settle the matter to their satisfaction. Their headman, a young, broad-chested black, severely draped in dark blue fringed cloths, with fierce nostrils and his hair all done up artfully in oily ringlets, stood near me. Problem, right? So these are the kinds of stereotypical images, but which, by the way, continued into Hollywood, into popular media until not that long ago, right? I think it's gotten better, but in fact, if you're interested, when we get to just a touch on climate fiction, which is a new field for me, I taught recently a book called The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, 1962, credited with being perhaps the first climate fiction novel. And it's really interesting, fascinating, but there are the same kinds of stereotypes of Africans in there, and he consciously has Conrad in mind, and that's a climate fiction novel, and yet the Africans men are depicted in the same way, and I'm thinking, boy, he hasn't progressed very far. So, as we know, the narrator is Marlowe, and I love that aspect of it, which is sort of this old seaman who's flawed, and he's telling everything in his own words, and stylistically it's quite brilliant. But it's a way in which I think Marlowe, who by the way appears in some other works by Conrad, is has his own prejudices as he's talking to the other seamen. And you might say, well, if you're charitable, you could say, well, this is After all, a crusty old seaman, right? But the problem is we're never given any contrasting comparative images of the Africans. So that's the test. Um, we all know about the civilizing mission kind of thing. The French use the same phrase as a kind of alibi for their practices in colonialism to say that we have a mission to civilize them, right? If you are using something as an alibi, that suggests that you have a little guilt, that you are trying painfully to whitewash what you are doing. So that's there. Um, the other thing to keep in mind as a backdrop is that if we are looking at other works by Achebe since then, where he has some of the descendants of those same characters experience Africa leading up to independence, then after independence. And just as Fanon warned about the pitfalls of nationalism, where you have to watch out because you have the same paradigms, you inherit all this stuff, and you can fall into the same traps, right? The same corruption. He shows that. He's not afraid. But it's interesting that he sided with the losing side in the Civil War that lasted from 1967 to 70. Like a lot of Igbo, uh, it was some called it the Biafran War, um, where sadly 6 7 years after independence, Nigeria was ripped apart. And of course, some of this has to do it's some of it has to do with the arbitrary borders that were, as we know, drawn up all over the world by the powers that be. But some of it had to do with simmering tensions that were already there. But again, these are the paradoxes, legacies of colonialism. So if you're interested, that's what Chimamanda Adichie has the novel Half of a Yellow Sun, which is about that war. Uh, Achebe writes and has essays on the war. So if you're interested. Um, what I think is great too is, and I will get to the eco-critical part in a minute, but what is great is that if I were a less great, as a less great writer and thinker, if I were writing a novel like this and I wanted to show my culture, right, and I was responding to Conrad, you might want to be tempted to romanticize it. You might be tempted to portray it in the best light. And in fact, a lot of communities, ordinary people say, don't, air the dirty laundry. Don't put on the best face, right? But so he did anger some Nigerians by saying, no, I have to show the humanity. That's what's really important here. Otherwise, we fall into the same trap. So the question that eventually confronts Okonkwo in the aftermath of Okonkwo, by the way, who kills himself, right? He cannot stand. He's always a man of action. He doesn't know how to respond to the frustrations. He's frustrated over he's made these tremendous mistakes on his own before the independence of colonialism. But he's angry because Christianity comes. One of his estranged sons, who he wants to be masculine and is not, converts, right, to Christianity. And so he's all angry. And he basically kills one of the British messengers, who is not even an Igbo, right? They come from another side. And then he hangs himself, which is taboo for his culture. And so this is a great tragedy. But what the question that really, you might say, well, that's his individual response, right? But his friend Obirika is angry with the British, right? Because this is effectively, he says, in effect, this is what you have done, right? Yes, he took his own life. This is not the actual words. What I'm saying is he implies that he took his own life, but he was pushed to this extreme. And the question that confronts everyone in this region is one that all post-colonial countries and peoples have had to face. How much of the pre-colonial past do we nurture and sustain, and how much do we change, right? So that's another aspect of this that I think is very difficult to answer. To give you an example, I mentioned Ngugi wa Thiong'o, right? And we're going to get to one of his novels in a minute. And I remember some of you know this, where he refused to write in English. We mentioned this the other day. But also think of his name. The first novel or two he published was under James Ngugi. And then he just revoked all that, right? So he, in real life, wanted to get back to his given name. And he refuses to use that Christian name. So in a sense, this idea of naming, right, we talked about, is not just in the novel, but is part of these writers' lives. Another aspect of this, and I know this is not eco-critical per se, is the use of proverbs, and I think that's very brilliantly done, where the sayings that they have, and storytelling and proverbs, right? And many of them have, especially the stories, have a link to the natural world in which they live. And I think this is also a way. It's not that he set out to say, I'm writing a novel about, the natural world, because it's not a novel. It's only relatively recently that eco-critics have come to it. But I think that this imagery of the animals is really fascinating. And the connection between humans and their natural world, right, is fascinating. We first encounter proverbs in the scene where Okoye comes to Unoka's hut and asks him to repay an old financial debt. You don't have to remember all these characters, but Okoye makes his request by speaking half a dozen sentences in proverbs, because proverbs, as the narrator tells us, are the palm oil with which words are eaten, which sounds like another proverb. So in other words, the narrator is describing this in formal English, but using metaphors that are earthy and germane only to that context. Palm oil, because they drink palm wine, and proverbs of the palm oil with which words are eaten. I love that. So they also convey to readers a uniquely Igbo perspective. So I have students currently who are Nigerian, who are Yoruba and Igbo from Nigeria. And it's interesting to get their views, right? And to talk about, they don't share, they speak in English. If the Yoruba and the Igbo, they're totally unrelated. So we forget that, right? If you go to a typical, I'm saying non-college going American, you might say, all they know is Africa, right? Which is the most diverse continent on the planet. So that's what I think is great about reading these, is you also get these local issues. And we were talking, I think, about bioregionalism, which I'll get to more, hopefully tomorrow, or a day after. But each region is different environmentally too. So I think that shapes the language. The other thing to keep in mind is that although we have an omniscient narrator, this narrator is clearly part of the community. Someone who talks almost in the fashion of legend, like Okonkwo is a legend. In those days, or he was known by, so that this narrator who's unnamed and ostensibly omniscient is nonetheless an Igbo, right? And so that's a very shrewd move as well. And I think what this portrays is the value of orature. And I think Kantapura by Raja Rao does that, and so do other novels, that it's very hard to do, to try to replicate, get a feel of spoken, of a narrator who's talking conversationally as if it's an oral story, but yet it's the novel, which is a modern kind of form. It's published, it's in English, So all those things it's very hard to balance that. So my folklore colleague, or she's retired now, was very insistent that we talk about orature to make it equivalent to literature. Right. Stories bind the Igbo people as a community. That's key. You get that time and again, and you get that in all these African novels in some way or another. Stories bind the community. Yesterday I mentioned the stories create place in a sense, because in terms of making a place meaningful, we need to have stories. Otherwise, it's just another place. The tourists who come to Antigua, there's no stories there, right? Or who go on the cruise ships, which sound really silly to me, but just roaming around in the ocean, and it's sort of, there's no anchoring referent. So in the hands of other alien stories tellers, stories are the very things that destroy them, such as at the end of the novel, the British administrator comes and says, maybe I'll give them a paragraph on the primitive tribes of the Upper Niger and mention the Igbo, right? Just a paragraph. And that's, first of all, the arrogance of that. And so you have to tell your own stories, obviously. The falling apart of the Igbo community can be traced to the fact that the Igbo consider the news of the white people's arrival to be only fairy tales. So that's another interesting aspect where at first they're kind of like, oh no, these are myths, right? Then they see one guy comes on a bicycle that they call an iron horse, because the bicycle had just been invented recently in the 1890s. So it was not familiar in everywhere. And they kill him. This one other village. And so they say, well, and then of course you know what happens. The colonialists come with their guns and kill. But it's interesting that in Umuofia, they said, some of the elders said, well, they serve, it's like, what else did they expect? You can't kill. That transgressed the rule of hospitality in a way. Without questioning, they just kill this guy. So there's interesting dynamics here. There's an interesting statement by one of the characters, not a major character, who's an uncle of Okonkwo, who says they're having a debate. So also he shows how they have debates. Agency. They have their own agency. And he says, there is no story that is not true. That's an interesting statement, right? And it could be true and felt to be true in a negative way. Could be felt, because we make narrative, we make our own myths, right? Nations make their own myths. As Ernest Renan said in the 1880s, the French theorist, all narratives have some aspect of forgetting. What we call convenient amnesia, right? You edit your stories, right? And so, yet they are sold as if they are transparent truths. So that's where what literature provides, those gaps, right? Because we are often, and it's understandable, if you're a child and you're reading all this time and again, right? You're just going to see it that way. There are certain states in the U.S., because states are very independent in the U.S., there are some states which have, their textbooks are horrendous. Like in Texas, they have like 2 pages on African American history in a big textbook for high school. So, of course, conscientious parents will supply more, but the average child will think, oh, that's irrelevant. So you can see how education still is a big factor today. In fact, there have been, I better not go off on this, but some years ago, the Chinese government was furious with the Japanese government because the textbooks they downplay the Nanjing massacre and rapes and so forth, which is a sore point, understandably, from the 1930s. So you can see where this becomes political as well. But nations want to narrate it in the way that appeases certain interests. The Igbo elders also failed to realize that their authority to write their own stories and to thereby control their own destinies is threatened by the colonizer. So they don't really grasp this idea that it's also the idea of telling your stories, being allowed to be the agent of your stories, that is threatened. Of course, if you're a writer, you tend to value the idea of storytelling. But I do think for everyday people, stories are important, right? You hear them from your grandparents, you hear them from others. The sociology of colonialism is also important. Just like individuals, every cultural group needs to have that sense of dignity. And Achebe's description of the tragedy captures the same nuanced psychology and contradictions that plague a Greek or a Shakespearean play or anything that you can name in the Western canon. I'm almost at the end of the note on Achebe. So the question is, again, you could research this and look at his essays. What is that book? I think it's called something about an English educated, person. I can't remember the exact title, but he talks in his essays about education, colonial education. So you can see that that's in his mind. And he says his decision to write in English is important because, as I said earlier today, you can also, just as you might revisit the Odyssey as Derek Walcott does, in order to change that paradigm, right? That's a powerful way. Because some people say, well, why do you have to go to the Western, these Western ideas? But I think some great works of literature, whether it's Tagore or Shakespeare or whatever, belong to the world in some ways. That's one way to look at it. And so, just as Walcott will change that from the inside, so I think does he write in English to sort of change English. That's what I was getting at. So we no longer have, that's why some people scholars choose to use the word Englishes with a small e, as you know. So we are not, because we tend to associate capital E English with England, right? And that's not the case at all. So I would also add, in my view, that no nation, as I've said before, no one owns a language. I think, I know there are debates about this, but I think that you can craft any language to use. And languages are never static to begin with. Taib Saleh, Season of Migration to the North. You can see abrupt change there from Nigeria to Sudan. Now, this was written in Arabic in 1966. I don't know, some of you know it. Yeah. It's a wonderful novel, really interesting, and according to scholars, well translated in 1969 by a Britisher. In the 1890s, the British sought to reestablish their control over the Sudan, which became a big part of Victorian iconography with Khartoum and, General Gordon, fighting to the end and all this stuff. And they made Hollywood movies of this. And it once more officially in the name of the Egyptian Khedive, but in actuality treating the country as a British colony. So they didn't really call it that, but they basically controlled it much of it in the 1890s. But as in many countries, you have the French, the British, the Belgians squabbling over the same area because the Nile headwaters are very lucrative and strategic. Britain feared that other powers would take advantage of Sudan's instability to acquire territory previously annexed to Egypt. So there's all these things going on. And then there was a rebellion, which Winston Churchill was involved with in 1898, and so forth and so on. And this was sort of the backdrop. So now the reason I mention this is because one of the characters in the novel, so the main character comes back to the Sudan after his education in Europe, and he's surprised to find someone in his village who's already been there and back and has a really weird stories to tell, and also has a secret library where he keeps all these English canonical works. So you get this sort of interesting way. So this is an Arabic novel. We have to keep that in mind. And Sudan was again one of those insignificant places in many ways, except when it came to strategy, like the Nile, right? Um, and we, by the way, bring it up to the present. South Sudan, we have the split of the country. It's not doing too well, right? There's a famine. It became independent in 2011, right? And so that the repercussions of these colonial periods are still with us. But the novel, the unnamed narrator has returned to his native village in Sudan after 7 years in England, furthering his education. He's an engineer. On his arrival, he encounters a new person in the village. He's not from there originally, named Mustafa Said, who exhibits none of the adulation for his achievements. So he's also been abroad, but he never talks about it. But he often recites poetry in English from memory. And then the narrator asks Mustafa about his past, and Mustafa tells the narrator much of his story, often saying, "I am no Othello, Othello was a lie." So we have the Shakespeare background because it transpires that Mustafa has had several affairs with English women while he was studying there and kills one of them. Murders one of them. It's strange, right? And so I think one of the things that perhaps Saleh is, and the title is interesting, Season of Migration to the North. So it's like, are we like birds that go to the north, which the north being England, right, in this case, and we come back. And if so, what does that mean? And secondly, it's also about engineering and the way that eco-criticism comes in, or the eco-critical aspect, the environmental aspect, is because water plays a big role here. The iconography of water, which I'll get to. Another thing to keep in mind is that gender and sexuality here come up in interesting ways, and if you're interested. So, for example, we know the trope, the colonized trope, this is also very Victorian and shared by many parts of the world, of feminizing the land, right? Land, woman, right? And I mentioned this the other day, and you're familiar with this. And if you look at the way, it's fascinating to look at the way that many 19th century naturalists, explorers, talking about the land just by casual, we'll talk about the virgin territory, and then we made the penetration of the land, this and that. And it's very Freudian, right? Without them knowing it. So now we can read this that way. Here we have a kind of like a fellow perhaps, a reversal of the, is this guy, it almost sounds like Mustafa has kind of taken out his bitterness on England by abusing and lying to these women and then killing one of them. It's very strange. He comes off as not a good guy, but the point is that, again, Saleh is not going to romanticize these issues, and he's going to talk about them. So, given that he's clearly critiquing both Western constructs of his land and his own people's complacency and sometimes complicity, we might want to think about why rape and other forms of sexual violence are so prominent. He also makes allusions to not just Othello, but Heart of Darkness again. So that's interesting. There's the doubling of the narrator in Mustafa. Some of these, we often have a doubling in like we have Jekyll and Hyde, most obviously. Conrad wrote a novella called The Secret Sharer. This idea of the double is fascinating to look at, which has been with us from ancient times. But in this case, is Mustafa kind of reflection of the narrator at an older age, right? That's something we'd have to think about. The doubling of Mustafa's widow as well, with the woman Jean Morris that Mustafa um, romances. But I would say one of the most notable motifs are books and reading. So when he goes into the secret room that Mustafa shows him, he's shocked by, which he hasn't shown anyone. He's shocked by all these wonderful classics there. So, what does that say about colonial education in that sense? Is it that, first of all, the villagers couldn't care less because they're not educated in the same way? Um, and I don't mean they're lesser educated, I just mean it in a different way. And then, but he finally wants to show someone else. He wants to share this secret knowledge, right? But we think of art as kind of redeeming us in some way, making us, ennobling us. But art can't ennoble us without a community, right? So he's doing this in solitude. He's cut off. These books are encased in a hermetic library, kind of like what the way the Bodleian Library at Oxford used to be, right? Which didn't allow Virginia Woolf in 200 years ago. If you just encase books and, in fact, to the point where in Victorian homes they'd have fake books, right? You can still buy these, I think. Oh, look at all these books I've read, and there's no book behind there. So this idea of literature without a community, that's a critique in post-colonial writing, where it's a hermetic kind of world. A key motif is also the invader, or the occupier, or the hunter. Mustafa invades Europe in a way, including its homes, the homes of the women he goes to. Is this a kind of revenge? I don't know. But Mehjoob, the narrator's childhood friend, seems to be especially observant about the realities of the post-colonial situation. He's there, he's living there, complaining that his government only talks and never acts. And so on, right? So I could go into a lot of things, but let me say this. The other thing is that at one point Mustafa quotes from one of the texts, and it turns out critics have written, well, that's a misquotation, right? But I think that misses the point. If he misquotes, that's part of the character. I mean, it's like Salman Rushdie writing the famous essay on errata or errors in Midnight's Children dealing with the Indian history, because it's the unreliable narrator that is doing this, right? So novels are not like in Garcia Marquez, same criticism. They're not maps of the actual place or the territory. They have poetic license, and I think that's critical to keep in mind. Leila Lalami, who's a well-known Arab-American novelist, writes in English, notes that Salih's use of the motif of the hero's journey into the unknown echoes Heart of Darkness, but also Gilgamesh, right? So, but it becomes a kind of nightmarish unreality. And it's interesting how often that idea of dreams I mentioned the other day as nightmare is a motif in all of these. So I'm going to end, though, with the section on this with, where was that? I lost my quote here where the narrator goes into the water, and I'll find the quote, but basically, here it is. Though floating on the water, he gets into water where they're building a canal, and it's never getting built, right? It's sort of this idea of development, post-colonial development, uneven development, and he's an engineer, and that's why he's there, coming back to his own village. He's supposed to, but he's frustrated by the government. Then he goes into the water and he says, though floating on the water, I was not part of it. I am from here just as the date palm in the courtyard has grown. Oh, sorry. He says he's not part of it, right? He's kind of changed. Another character tells him, "I am from here, just as the date palm in the courtyard has grown in our house, not anyone else's." So you have this idea of some alienation from the land as a result of his going abroad. Now, that doesn't mean he's criticizing the wish to go abroad and get educated. But okay, I'll stop there and then I'll turn to, and do you know, Ankita, what time we go to? Okay, thank you. So now we come to The River Between by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is 1965, when Kenya, of course, has not been independent that long. And in the 1950s, we have the backdrop is the Mau Mau Rebellion, where spontaneous uprising happens against the British. And that's why the British retaliate by rounding up all kinds of young men whom they see as like 18 and older, even if they're innocent, and just corralling them. So this is told by a young man named Waiyaki, who's the protagonist. At an early age, he was already considered to have special gifts, and his father thinks this is interesting, thinks he is going to be the savior of the people to lead them to freedom. That would be a big burden, right? But I think this interesting idea of a savior complex, of a savior motif, comes into play. He explains to the young Waiyaki the legend of a savior who would be born into their village and accomplish great things. And he says, "You're that savior," right? Although Waiyaki is skeptical of such a fantastical prophecy, he excels in school and goes on, right? And he's very smart. And his father wants him to get the knowledge of the colonists so he can then turn it against them. Now it's interesting to kind of make your son do that, and you know already that this is not going to turn out well, right? So it's another tragedy like Okonkwo and his son Nwoye. There's some of that there, right? As the story goes on, the division between these two different villages intensifies, and it also revolves around female circumcision, which became a big topic, and it still is, and the UN has gotten involved. And this is a sensitive topic. And so this young girl is supposed to get circumcised, but she dies. And so this stirs up a lot of people, and the British then indiscriminately dismiss a number of students, including Waiyaki, the protagonist, and he's forced to leave the school, and so he starts a new school. So remember that motif of education being important. So he says, "I'm going to start my own school to educate other young Kenyans and Gikuyu Kenyans," and he takes that burden upon himself, which seems noble, of course, at the time. He does not fully understand, how he's going to do this, but he realized that the mission, his mission, is to do this. He becomes so preoccupied that he doesn't realize, however, he's blind to the fact that certain lands are being grabbed by the colonizers, right? So others are trying to fight that battle, and he decides to focus on education. That's also the dilemma that a lot of these folks face. And so he feels some may accuse him of not acting. Another character named Kabonyi, who wants to destroy Waiyaki, partly out of jealousy, and he does eventually, he kind of tricks him, and so Waiyaki gives in to this, and Waiyaki blames himself for having failed to address the lack of unity at the time. So another tragedy, but in this case, very realistic sort of portrayal of the Gikuyu and the idea that land is being usurped, right? Do we focus on education, right, in order to fight that, or do we take action now? Does that make sense? And rebel. Um, and again, I think religion is a key factor of societal change brought about by the introduction of Christianity here, but it doesn't have to be Christianity. The point is any sort of system of belief that estranges you, right? And sometimes the Europeans themselves don't agree on this. Um, and by the way, some of the villagers do, as Fanon called for, he said, violence sometimes is necessary. So, and remember, this is written in 1965. So, I would bet that Ngugi, being he's also very widely read. He's read all of these kinds of. This is a time of newly independent countries, and some have not become independent yet. And so there's about a lot of foment. So Wretched of the Earth comes out in 1961, and I think he's exploring how different characters are caught up in this, right? There are a number of characters. There's also, for example, Livingston, a Protestant missionary, which is interesting because we know of David Livingstone, the Scottish guy who ironically became such a big deal in the 1870s simply because they portrayed him in the media as sort of the lone white guy among all these blacks in Africa, right? And this self-serving, this is where media comes in because a guy named Stanley, who was Irish, who wrote for an American newspaper. Anyway, he writes a book of going in to try to find Livingstone, and he called it In Darkest Africa. And this is also what Conrad has been reading, right? So these are the books, Ngugi's and Achebe's, that are responding to that, right? Because even in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and I would say once in a while we still find these images, though it's getting a lot better. You get this idea of sort of parts of Africa as being sort of, intimidating, dangerous, dark, and so forth. That has lingered since that time. The irony is that David Livingstone really didn't understand why they were so eager to find him. He was quite happy in Africa. So, but Stanley was very self-serving. Anyway, one message of Ngugi's novel, like Achebe's, is that the ills of colonialism cannot be treated with the tools of colonialism. So we can't just use only Western education to counter that enculturated sense, and that's another challenge, right? It's the first novel he wrote actually at a relatively young age, though it was the second to be published. And it's probably, according to scholars, one of the first to address the complex thoughts and feelings of Africans, except for Achebe's, living under colonialism. Here we come back to some context that before I come to the end here, in 11:30, so we just have 4 minutes, if I remember correctly. There was a 1962, if you're interested, famous African Writers Conference, which exposed Ngugi and others to the lack of literary material produced in their region. And if you're interested, at Makerere University, there was a famous statement in the 60s about why do English departments only teach, English and also just European stuff. So already from the get-go, these guys are pretty brave. They're students, some of them. Some are professors. And Ngugi wrote that novel when he was still a student, who are brave enough because they don't know how this is going to be received, right? Let me just read a couple more points. The river between distills the atmosphere of urgency, self-questioning, and change into a beautifully compact and I'm quoting a scholar here, I should say, I have the sources in the notes. Almost dystopian Bildungsroman set in a vaguely fictional historical context um, at the time. So almost dystopian. That's an interesting way to talk about it, right? It's a tragic outcome, and it also offers us. It doesn't offer us any idea that there was peace. In other words, it doesn't say there was a sort of golden age before the Europeans came. Just like Achebe, it's not like there were tensions between villages. In fact, remember in Achebe's novel, he has to kill Ikemefuna, and that is a tradition that, or Ikemefuna has to die, and that is a tradition that was there independently. But of course, Okonkwo transgresses that. The point is, again, they're not allowed to do this on their own terms. They're not allowed to change on their own terms. So let me just read the opening and then I'll stop because this gets us to the landscape. The two ridges lay side by side. One was Kameno, the other was Makuyu. Between them was a valley. It was called the Valley of Life. Behind Kameno and Makuyu were many more valleys and ridges lying without any discernible plan. They were like many sleeping lions which never woke. They just slept, the big, deep sleep of the Creator. Almost again in that oral, sort of fable-like way. But notice he says, without any discernible plan. This is not something that is mapped according to the Europeans. And so, but we also get a sense of land, right? The privileging of geography, place, and the connection with stories. So I wanted to reiterate that mythic legends, whatever, are key to this, right? In fact, Jomo Kenyatta, it might be worth talking about. Well, no, I'll save that quote for later. Let me just check, make sure. Oh, was I supposed to talk about nervous conditions? I think I was. And we have 1 minute. But I will talk about nervous conditions, which a novel I love. I just finished teaching it again. I've taught it several times. And if I may just say, I'll come back to this and talk. We could also talk in the Q&A tomorrow before the lecture. But again, a focus on education, but a focus on psychology. The psychology of, that's why she invokes Fanon, and she herself is a psychologist. And I think that is key. So now the question becomes, how do this, remember post-colonialism is kind of the impetus is Marxism on the one hand, political action, as well as psychoanalysis. And there's been these debates. But I think these writers are well aware of that. And you might say, well, a focus on the psychology, that doesn't seem to have much to do with environment, right? But it does. And Dangarembga shows that. It doesn't mean they're identical, but she does show both. And I'm sorry, I was not watching the time. So I'm going to have to come back to that. And I will close today. So if you're interested, come a little early tomorrow. We can have a Q&A. Thank you, folks. Yes, end of the lectures for today.